Hello, and welcome to Nightmare Masterclass. My name is David Stockdale. I'll be your host on this excursion into the dark unknown. We're going to be doing something a bit different in this installment, so bear with me here. This is the first part of an ongoing series titled The Theorist's Handbook, which, I realize this is not so much a handbook as it is a series of short videos, but think metaphorically, people. After all, that's kind of what this whole thing is about. In this series, I'll be talking about how I approach the task of critical analysis. And I should note that there are all sorts of related or semi-analogous terms that can be used here. But for the sake of brevity, I'm going to be sticking with critical analysis for the remainder of this video. Critical analysis is essentially the purpose of my channel, aside from just, talking about things that interest me. But what exactly is critical analysis? There is certainly not universal agreement on that topic, and it is not my goal to get bogged down in terminology here. I should first note that one's approach to critical analysis is largely informed by one's perspective on the function of art in society. More on that in a minute. For now, it would suffice to say that critical analysis, particularly with respect to art, is the act or process of deriving meaning from a work. Or at least that's one way of looking at it. That is the broadest, most inclusive definition I can think of. Now, the one point I want to emphasize here is that there is no such thing as a definitive interpretation of any given work. Or at least, that's my position. You might think that I'm just being humble when I say that I'm not the last word with respect to the topics I cover. That is not exactly the case. It's more so that I'm philosophically opposed to the idea that there can be a last word or a definitive interpretation of a work of art. I think that's just a silly idea, and I hope to explore the philosophical underpinnings of that position in a future video. As I've said before, some of the best projects have sparked lively discussions and indeed produced a vast swath of competing interpretations. So while I'm certainly not the last word on the topics I cover, I do think I have a few observations and bits of advice that might prove useful if you're interested in doing what I do. This first video is going to be a bit of an informal, introductory sort of foray into the topic of critical analysis. The tone I'm shooting for here is not exactly a lecture, but rather a casual discussion. I really consider this to be more of a personal essay than it is a formal, systematic unpacking of the topic. Namely because I'm not really sure if the latter would be all that useful to my audience. With this in mind, allow me to start off by saying that I don't think critical analysis is something that is solely reserved for people with doctorates or postgraduate degrees or whatever. While, of course, high-level work is vital, we all know that there are very real and serious social and economic barriers to achieving that level of education. And I'm far more interested in promoting or fostering a certain critical attitude in my viewers, most of whom I'll go ahead and assume are not hyper-educated. And for those of you who are, please continue to correct my various mistakes and inaccuracies. Just for the sake of transparency, I should note that I have a bachelor's degree in English with a concentration in theory, criticism, rhetoric, and language. Yeah, I know that's a mouthful. And of course, I recognize that not everyone has that level of education, nor does everyone come from that specific liberal arts background. But really, I'm of the opinion that certain modes of analysis are actually pretty intuitive and well fitted for the layperson's disposal. It is often the case that they just need the vocabulary and the context to enable them to think in a critical and indeed emancipatory way. Critical analysis with respect to art is, in a certain sense, a language game. Now, I'm not saying that to diminish the importance of critical analysis. I don't mean to reduce the process to a trivial game. Rather, what I want to emphasize here is that there is a certain set of conditions that can enable one to think in a critical way. Simply put, the language used can sometimes seem daunting, impossible even, to decipher. And that's why I often try to define and unpack important concepts in the course of my analysis. Let me just cite a few examples here. In my Petscop series, I talk about a concept called critical empathy. In my analysis of Wham City's The Cry of Man, I talked about hermeneutics, and even going as far back as to my very first video, Decoding This House Has People in It, I talked about a literary genre called magical realism. In each of these cases, my hope was and continues to be that my audience internalizes these concepts so that they're able to make critical connections in the course of their own thought process. And well, let me admit something here. My motivations for doing this series are, to some extent, self-serving. You see, critical analysis is kind of an esoteric thing, and I personally want to see more of it, particularly on YouTube. Sure, there are a few prominent YouTube channels that do something akin to critical analysis. Although really, I've noticed that those with real and explicit ambition in that regard are, unfortunately, few and far between. Over the course of this series, I'll use works that I've covered in the past to illustrate how I approach the task of critical analysis. In this video, I'll be discussing what it is I mean by the term critical analysis, and more broadly, what it means to think critically about something like, say, a work of art, whether it's a film, a TV show, or some weird internet series. And let me just say that thinking critically about these things is something that I find incredibly fulfilling and, well, useful in everyday life. That second part might be a bit counterintuitive, but yes, I do think it's actually useful to think about these topics in a critical fashion. As I've previously alluded to, critical reflection is, in large part, contingent upon the ability to make connections between certain concepts. I think this is a skill set that can be honed, largely through reading and engaging with both art and critical works. For example, in my latest video, I discussed how Doki Doki Literature Club can be thought of as a work of meta-modernism. In the process of interpreting this game, I had this notion of meta-modernism floating around in my head from reading various essays and indeed watching a few YouTube videos. In fact, some of those sources ended up in the additional viewing and reading portion of the video description. The point here is that after having played the game, that is to say, upon reflection, I observed that some of the underlying themes in the work tend to evoke this meta-modernist sensibility as spelled out by philosophers Timotheus Vermeulen and Robin Vandenacker. Specifically, I think DDLC is a game that works towards this notion of pragmatic idealism, which is an essential quality of metamodernism. So the ability to form connections like this is important for the purposes of critical analysis. So too is the ability to make critical distinctions. With this in mind, let's talk about what critical analysis is not. The purpose of this is not to browbeat or admonish people who don't perform analysis in a manner that adheres to my beliefs. Rather, it is to elucidate the idea of critical analysis by reducing it to its essential components. With this in mind, let me just say that critical analysis is not merely the summarization of a work. I should state that my goal at Nightmare Masterclass is not merely to present explanations of the material I cover vis-a-vis the plot, or vis-a-vis the particulars of any given story. In many cases, specifically with respect to more mainstream works of television and film, I will do my audience the courtesy of assuming that most of you can figure out that sort of thing for yourselves. But in some cases, such as, for instance, Petscop, certain ambiguous elements are actually built into the plot itself. Sometimes I would say there's a distinct function for that sort of ambiguity in the story, and as such, I will speculate on the plot mechanics and other specifics with respect to where the story is going, and how that ambiguity works to create a certain effect. And oftentimes I will summarize certain aspects of the plot, or indeed the entire work, in order to discuss how those elements fit together, again, in order to elicit a certain effect. In all of these cases, I am far more interested in discussing how the work in question reflects or says something about the society in which it was created, and moreover how such works can often expose or artfully depict certain underlying problems in society. So, critical analysis is not merely summarization, nor is it, I would say, the purpose of critical analysis to merely celebrate the works that one might particularly enjoy, or to explain the manner in which thinking about a work in a certain way might enhance one's enjoyment of it. If this is, in fact, the case with some work, it is only true to me in a peripheral sense. Now, in certain cases, if I can, in some small way, support the artist by drawing attention to their work, I think that's a good thing that has resulted from my analysis, but it's not the primary goal, not for me at least. And while I might at certain points offer praise for some of the projects I cover, most of them in fact, my goal has never been to prop up any work as an ideal or pure form. In that regard, I increasingly tend to think it's kind of tiresome and specious to compare things in terms of their supposed greatness or artistic merit, although I'm sure I've been guilty of this in the past. The problem is that these are incredibly loaded words that in the past have been used in some pernicious and pretty questionable ways. They need to be used with considerable forethought. On that note, let me just reiterate something that I said towards the beginning of this video. The function of critical analysis is largely informed by one's position on the function of art in society. That is something I hope to talk in more depth about in future videos, but for the time being, let me just lay my cards on the table. I explicitly reject the idea of art for art's sake. That is to say, I don't believe in celebrating art as an individual expression outside of, or perhaps one might say above, any socio-political context. In fact, I think that people who espouse this belief are essentially putting art on a pedestal, thus treating the artist as a kind of god. In its most extreme form, I would say that this idea of art for art's sake is something akin to religious fundamentalism. I realize that this is an incendiary thing to say, but I feel that it's true. Maybe evangelism would be a more charitable term in this context. But the point here is that people who espouse this idea are just replacing God with art. Similarly, those who espouse creativity and originality as intrinsic virtues without discussing the material conditions that give rise to such qualities, or without respect to how such qualities are directed in a political sense, and indeed often used very selectively, so too are these sorts guilty of a certain, shall we say, fetishization of the artistic process. At best, this is a misguided view, I think, of how art functions in contemporary society. At worst, it's downright harmful. Maybe I'll do a whole video about that. I'm going to say something here that shouldn't be all that controversial. Good art should do something good. And we can certainly quibble over what good is in any given context. But I think in general that art, or at least the kind of art I'm interested in, should work towards something worthwhile. I'm tempted to say that art should have a good message, but I think that might be a bit of an oversimplification. I'm not talking about Full House here, where every episode is wrapped up with a neat, sentimental kind of moral. And I don't mean to say that all art should be uniform in its approach towards this task. I've covered a diverse array of different kinds of work on my channel, and my goal for this year is to widen my net even further. Art can accomplish its task in any number of ways, and in fact, some of the most interesting cases to me are the ones where elements of horror and surrealism are utilized to create a certain effect. But that effect has to work towards something. It'll probably be a little clearer if I cite an example here. And, well, let's talk about Petscop. At its core, I think that Petscop is an artful examination of the material conditions that give rise to the abuse, mistreatment, and exploitation of children. I think the work, despite being fragmented and ambiguous in certain ways, is astoundingly cohesive in its approach towards this goal. I talk about this in depth in my Petscop investigation series, so check that out if you haven't already seen it. It would suffice to say that in this case, the work, Petscop, is exposing something harmful about society. That's my view. And for the record, you're totally free to disagree with me here about any of these points. But if you do, I'm going to challenge you to think about why it is that you disagree, and I want you to articulate that as best you can in the comments section. I do want your thoughts on this new series, and I realize that it's a bit of a change of pace as compared to my other videos, but I am hoping you find it useful. Depending on the sort of feedback I get here, I might just integrate comment responses in future videos. Okay, so winding down, for those of you who are wondering where my next Petscop video is, I just want to let you know that I have no immediate plans to put out another one at this point. Yes, I realize that Petscop 11 and 12 have been released, and it's certainly taking an interesting turn. But I'm not quite at the point yet where I feel that I have enough material to justify putting out a new video. That said, I might do another one somewhere down the line if I feel I have something new and interesting to say about it, something that I haven't already said. I'm sorry if this disappoints you, but, well, just trust me on this. That wraps it up for this short installment of The Theorist's Handbook. Now, if you enjoy my videos and you have a few bucks to spare, please consider supporting me on Ko-fi.com/NightmareMasterclass. Any donation, large or small, is highly appreciated. And if you donate over $10 in the next 2 weeks, I'll give you a shout out in my next video. If that's the case, please specify how you'd like to be credited in your message when you donate. Thank you for watching, and good night.